We
Okay.
are now recording. And in about a minute, I'll do a share screen.
Annie, at 6:59, should I admit people?
No, wait till I share.
Okay.
Okay, open the house.
Okay, I'm opening the house.
There's a problem? Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I am Patty Zimmerman, and with Tom Chevery, we are the co-directors of the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival. At exactly this time last year, we shuttered the Embodied Festival and ran 3 online exhibitions instead. So welcome to the 24th edition of the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival. This year is a historic year. COVID, protests on racial inequalities, masks, vaccines, remote learning, the Zoomiverse, the yearning for connections around ideas and community. This year, for the first time in 24 years, we are 100% virtual. We have 2 FLEF mottos for this year: FLEF, a different environment, and the other motto, we are the screen. Both developed by our festival producers, Anne Michelle and Phil Wild from Insights International, who are working the back end of this wonderful event tonight. We are delighted and honored that all of you from everywhere can join us today for this edition of F2F, Feminist to Feminist, with Dr. Nicole Horsley and Dr. Carla Golden in interview. This FLEF event is a co-production with the Ithaca College Women's and Gender Studies program. We will be doing very short introductions to save time for important dialogues. During this event, please look at the chat for the extended bios, links, and references to what our speakers will be discussing. Participants should use the chat for questions as they think of them. At the very end of this session, we ask all of you on this Zoom to unmute your microphones and to put your video on to applaud our presenters in real time live. It's now my deep pleasure to introduce my valued and treasured colleague in all things feminist, Dr. Claire Gleitman, who is professor of English and the director of the Women and Gender Studies program at Ithaca College. Her research focuses on theaters and plays, and she is the director of the On the Verge program of staged readings. And she is she's a founding member of the programming team of F2F. Dr. Gleitman?
Thank you, Patty, and good evening, everyone. We're so happy to see you all here. As Patty said, my name's Claire Gleitman, well, I don't need to say anything more about myself because Patty said it all. So I'll just tell you quickly a little bit about F2F, which is co-directed and co-sponsored by myself and Patty Zimmerman, and by Women's and Gender Studies and FLEF. The idea for F2F grew out of conversations we had this past summer. A number of faculty members had this past summer who were interested in finding more opportunities for faculty to learn about one another's scholarship, particularly in the areas of feminist and gender studies. As some of you have heard me say before, we latched onto the name F2F because we liked its great array of different possible meanings, including faculty to faculty, feminist to feminist, field to field, festival to festival, friend to friend, and we hope fairly soon now, perhaps, thanks to the vaccines, face-to-face. We've hosted 5 F2F events so far this academic year, and there will be one more in April. Date and interviewer still to be determined, but Sumru Atak in the politics department has agreed to be interviewed, so please stay tuned for that. I'm just going to take a minute to introduce our interviewer this evening, and then I'll turn things over to her. It is my enormous pleasure and honor to introduce Carla Golden, recently retired from the psychology department after a 37-year career at Ithaca College as a developmental feminist psychologist. Throughout all of those years, as quite a few of you here know, Carla was a beloved and admired professor with the highest of standards who taught such incredibly popular courses as Psychology of Women, Feminist Psychology, and an honors course called Sex, Gender, and Desire. Carla was instrumental in founding the Women's Studies program in 1995. She served as coordinator of Women's and Gender Studies for 7 years. And as her great and precious parting gift to us, she did the lion's share of the work to propose and set in motion a new Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies major, which we are very hopeful we're going to be launching as soon as this fall. Carla's scholarly work focuses on psychoanalytic feminism and women's sexual identity. She's the co-editor of a widely used anthology called Lectures in the Psychology of Women, now in its 5th edition. I have said repeatedly and often that I see generally in women's and gender studies specifically can't possibly be the same without Carla. So I'm so very happy that we were able to persuade her to jump back into the thick of things and conduct this interview. So with no further ado, I'll turn things over to Carla. You might want to use a speaker view because there's a lot of people here that will allow you to focus on the interviewer and interviewed. And take it away, please, Carla and Nicole.
Thank you so much, Claire, and welcome to everyone for coming this evening. I'm just delighted to be introducing Professor Nicole Horsley, whom I met when she first came to Ithaca in the summer of 2016. We got together for coffee at Gimme on Cayuga Street, and there's a fun story to tell about that, but here I'll just note that it was a meeting that set the stage for us across differences of age, race, and life experience to become fast friends and fervent feminist colleagues. So there you have some more F words to add to your nomenclature. Professor Horsley is in her 4th year as an assistant professor at Ithaca College in the Center for the Study of Culture, Race, and Ethnicity, and she's a very valued affiliated faculty in women's and gender studies. She received a BA degree in women's studies from UCLA in 2007. She completed 2 master's degrees, one in women's studies and the other in education, both at the Claremont Graduate University in 2010. And she got her PhD from the University of Indiana at Bloomington in 2016 in African American and African diaspora studies. Tonight, we'll talk about how her life and academic trajectory leads to the work she's doing today, which I think you'll see is deeply grounded in her personal and political position as a self-identified Black radical femme teacher, scholar, and pleasure-seeking activist. In keeping with her academic training and her commitment to the larger Black community, Nicole's scholarly work is multidisciplinary and intersectional, and it centers Black women's subjectivities, bodies, desires, and pleasures as she aims to articulate a theory of Black sexual liberation. I'm going to mention just a few of her works in order to give you a sense of the range of issues she works on. In a soon-to-be-published chapter in the 2nd edition of a widely used anthology, Rethinking Women's and Gender Studies, Professor Horsley takes on the term femininity and asks the reader to consider what it would look like if Black women were centered in how we conceptualize the term. By prioritizing the bodies of femme-identifying, queer, as well as non-binary, trans, and disabled people as they intersect with Blackness, she proposes a radical rethinking of femininity that departs from white supremacist constructions which exclude women of color. And in the process, she proposes a more substantive anti-racist project for the whole of women's and gender studies. In an article she published just last year in the Journal of Hip Hop Studies, she offers an anti-establishment reading of both the lyrics and mediated performances of a range of female hip hop artists to show how they refuse not only dominant representations of Black female sexuality, but how they resist respectability politics as well in embracing an empowered and pleasure-seeking sexuality. The article also provides a hip hop starter kit for use by secondary school teachers who want to teach the material. And I mention this because it illustrates Nicole's deep commitment to sharing knowledge in an accessible format that can be useful to people outside university settings. She also has a chapter forthcoming in a book called Sexual and Intimate Occupations on the representation and denigration of Black women's genitalia. In this piece, Dr. Horsley boldly articulates a personal, theoretical, and instructional approach to the big Black clit, and does so by staging a Black lesbian intervention of sorts, one that instructs women on sexual anatomy and clitoral stimulation, while also highlighting feminist theories on gender and sexual performance. She imagines how Black women's genitalia could be represented out of the misogynist white supremacist gaze, and how women might experience their anatomy as sites of sexual pleasure, even as the white colonial imagination constructs Black bodies, female bodies, as abject. She advocates pleasure activism as a form of resistance on the path to liberation. I should also say that Nicole's research methodology has taken her to various archives across the country, including the Kinsey Institute for Research on Sex, Gender, and Reproduction, where she seeks to bring to view photographs, postcards, and other visual and sonic artifacts created by Black women artists, photographers, media makers, as well as forgotten and unknown women as they narrate their own stories of pain, survival, healing, and joy. Nicole is working on a book project which seeks to articulate a theory of sexual liberation, one that reimagines and invents alternative futures for Black bodies. The driving force motivating all of her research and teaching is the pursuit of Black liberation in the face of persistent anti-Blackness and gendered racism. In all of her work, she consistently centers the voices of poor and working class, diversely gendered, queer people in marginalized Black and brown communities, and she does so by both drawing from and contributing back to what she characterizes as the living, breathing Black lesbian archive, or perhaps I should say Black lesbian archives, plural, which creates space for radical possibilities. And it's this archive or archives that we're going to really be exploring tonight. So welcome, Dr. Horsley.
Thank you, Dr. Golden. I sound amazing coming from you. That was like amazing. Thank you.
All right, well, let's jump right in. And I wanted to, we've kind of divided this up into a 3-part session. I hope we have enough time, but I want to start with the personal as political, because that's a critical tenet of feminist theory. And so I'd like to ask you to situate yourself as a Black girl growing up in Southern California, LA to be precise, in the 1990s. Is there anything from your experience of girlhood in LA that foreshadows or your current work as a scholar, looking at Black liberation, women's desires, queerness, anything there that might come to mind as relevant to our discussion tonight?
Everything, right? I mean, when I think about hood feminism, and I consider myself to be someone from the hood, I'm from South Central, and I think about gender, sexuality, this idea around queerness that I didn't quite understand or get, but it was very much present in my community. A part of the archive that we're going to be discussing has multiple members of my family, including my aunt, who was a dancer at one of the only Black lesbian clubs, the Catch One in LA. I heard about it before I then, as an adult, attended that particular nightclub. But these various kind of ways in which I engage with my community, always in a kind of void, in an absence of sexuality, it's present and it's there, but this idea of queerness wasn't quite embraced. And lesbians were there and present, but weren't always necessarily pointed out to me in a very positive way. And so that is very much a part of, I think, my identity structure as identifying as someone radical, femme, lesbian, and taking that into the work that I do.
Great. So how'd you find your way to women's studies as an undergraduate, as a major?
It was by accident. It wasn't intentional. When I went to UCLA, I thought initially I was going to go into medicine. I was like, I'm going to mispronounce something and misdiagnose somebody. And so I just kind of fumbled around and I looked and I searched and started taking classes, and I found a Black professor, Black female professor, woman professor, Dr. Radcliffe, in the history department, but she was teaching courses in women and gender studies. And she was just so amazing. And any class I could take with her, I would take it. And so I found her and Dr. Keys, and I realized this is where, you know, I feel whole and I feel a sense of myself in this particular space. Black studies wasn't quite a department yet. And so there is where I end up going to women and gender studies. I had never heard of women's studies. I had never heard of women in the history text in anywhere in my education. So it gave me this kind of sense of self.
So you got into it enough to pursue a master's degree in women's studies, along with one in education. And I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but I guess my next question is, what led you, after a BA and a master's in women's studies, to pursue a PhD program in African diaspora and African American studies? And not to ask a leading question, but did women's and gender studies PhD programs not seem welcoming, or what was that switch from women's studies to African American studies?
Mm-hmm. Well, initially, going to UCLA, I didn't really have, like I said, any Black professors, maybe 2 or 3 that I can recall. And so when I was recruited into, or at Claremont, into the Women and Gender Studies program by the director, Dr. Linda Perkins, she offered me a great opportunity to go. And I had never heard of Claremont College before, even though I'm from California. I went. And there I continued that work, and it was more in depth. It allowed me to deal with popular culture, Black popular culture. And because I loved teaching, education, I found my way to the education department as well. But I found a way in which I can pretty much kind of bring these two fields together. And it was also important when I went on to the PhD. I really wanted to learn more about Black women. I felt like that had been negated my entire education. At UCLA, I didn't really have Black professors, and the ones they did teach about Black women, but everybody else did not. And so I decided, I made a choice when I applied to the PhD program, that I was going to study in a predominantly Black department, so that I can situate and understand Black people, Black subjectivity, Black bodies. And I thought I could do both. And I was looking at the professors, and a majority of the professors that I really wanted to work with, they were affiliates in women and gender studies. But usually women and gender studies is a predominantly, white woman kind of enterprise. And so I really thought it was necessary to try and situate myself and learn my history.
Okay, so now that you are postgraduate school and you have your feet kind of firmly planted both within women's studies and Black studies, curious to know whether whether you see that as a seamless combination, or whether the historical and even present sexism in women, racism in women's studies, sexism in Black studies makes that pairing a difficult one, or is it what are the tensions, if any?
Mhm. Well, I think because I am a Black person, a Black woman, we are strategists and survivors, and so we make a way. And I think that I learned early on as a child probably to make a way, make something out of nothing. And so, even when I didn't have things available to me, I made it through by getting what I could at UCLA. And similar at doing the PhD and on as now, assistant professor, is that I find the things that I need, in part looking at particular texts, finding people in the community and on campus, to really situate this idea, these kind of networks that I need to sustain myself.
Mhm.
I think that I've always been able to just navigate these particular spaces, because I've always kind of been like, that odd person out. And I think and we'll probably talk about this later, but that idea around the freak comes out for me, because, I was like a Black nerd, a kid nerd. And so how do you then navigate these particular spaces when, you are the odd person out? And so I think that it just became natural to be able to navigate myself in these particular spaces.
Mhm, mhm. Can you just say a few words about some things you read, both as at any point in your career that really were transformational for you? And from our talk, I know that a lot of it derived from the Black lesbian archives that really transformed you, and that I see in some sense you contributing back to. So you want to just name a couple of really important things that have shaped you?
Yes. And we talked about this, that I accidentally, out of curiosity and out of my identity, I found my way to the Student Center at UCLA, and I saw that there was a queer center, LGBT. It wasn't all the acronym wasn't complete yet. And I kind of went in there, and I was a little scared at first initially, like, do I go in here? And I went in, and there was a library, and I sat, and I would just sit in there and I would read. And in fact, I still have the book that I loved, and it brought me to this sense of self. I didn't know that Black women like Barbara Smith, The Truth That Never Hurts, Writings on Race, Gender, and Freedom existed. And so I remember sitting with this particular text and just reading. I think I read it in one sitting, and it led me to others because she's quoting amazing people in here. And so I found Pat Parker, in her poetry. I ended up finding Audre Lorde, and Combahee River Collective, and just a host of amazingness of just women and writers. And it was like, like in a cookie jar, and Jill Gomez. And I just couldn't believe that all of this existed. And of course, I started to look outside of my community of school, into the broader community. And I found an organization, YLOA, United Lesbians of African Heritage. And it was there as well that I began to start to really understand who I am. And Alexis Gumps and a whole bunch of others were a part of this organization. And it just was like just gift giving to have such an amazing community to really usher me in.
Wow. Well, that's a perfect segue into talking about the Black lesbian archives. But I just want to ask you one quick question, which is that in my introduction to you, I described you self-identified as a Black radical femme lesbian, unapologetic, pleasure-seeking activist. Is there any part of that you want to elaborate that's critical, or did I? I'm just wondering whether the statement of the terms is enough, or whether there's anything in that you'd want to say more about. We're going to return to the pleasure-seeking activism at the very end, but are we good with that definition, or that self?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
I think it's important, right? I mean, even when we think about Cheryl Clark and her work, lesbianism is, even the name is a resistance, right? It's important to be there, to have it there, to wear that marker, especially for someone who is feminine and identifies as a femme. And so having femme, having lesbian there are political markers. They're radical markers, they're of resistance, they're acts of resistance. And I think they're really important because of they lead us to these other kind of conversations. I felt so lucky that in my interview actually for Ithaca College, Belisa and everyone in the interview, I remember saying that I was either a lesbian or queer. I named myself, and I kind of remember their reaction was like, okay, like, you know, she's a whole complete person. She is, you know, like unabashed, and I'm going to be truthful and honest in my identity structure. So I think that that's always important to place those particular labels there.
Fantastic. So that's a perfect way to move into the discussion of the Black Lesbian Archives, which clearly were critical in your foundation in women's studies and Black studies. I mean, all the people that you named, I don't know whether folks in the audience, you know, what era they're from, but whether the names Pat Parker, Joel Gomez, Barbara Smith of the Combahee River Collective, I don't know if those names are relevant, but people should definitely know them. So, so the Black Lesbian Archives has been just critical to your development as a scholar. And I wonder if you could, you know, people know what the word archive means, but I wonder if you could really define for people here what you mean by the Black Lesbian Archive more specifically. And also if I should be pluralizing it. Should it be Black Lesbian Archives? So yeah, could you just give us an explanation or how you understand the Black Lesbian Archives?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's multiple archives, right? There's archives within the archives, within the archives, within the archives, things that are hidden texts, people who are yet to be discovered. And so how I talk about the Black Lesbian Archives is this kind of mapping of a space of lived experiences, oral traditions, modalities, and these kind of ways of being of women across the African diasporas who develop emotional bonds to each other and other people outside of the community. I kind of use and I think about Cheryl Clark's definition around lesbian, that whole identity structure. And she says, you know, I, for one, identify as a woman, and I call any woman who identifies herself as a lesbian who she is, a lesbian, right? And so I think that's important to go into the archives already having that understanding that this is it's a fixed term, but it also has fluidity there, right? That it is not necessarily this absolute. And so the archive, it opens up, I think, to a host of individuals within that kind of, you know, framework. And the archive, it decenters written texts, Eurocentric texts and methodologies and practices as the primary source of pre-existent lived artifacts that allow for this kind of creation of multiple archives that are different across space and time. It also is a project of decolonization, right? It takes into consideration Black performance theories that center oral traditions and on-the-ground movements, which are really important. And I think about acts of survival, like, you know, your sexuality, lesbianism, Black lesbianism, being an act of survival, and these other kind of performative aspects of Black life. And it also, I think this archive that I work within and that I have begin to construct, it asks about other archives that are there in existence that, you know, we might not know about, that exist outside of the institution, that might be unrecognizable, that have been silent, or just aren't in plain sight because they have been hidden for, you know, historically marginalized reasons. But this archive is about privileging the creative and the sensatory, and it recognizes Black social life within the realms of this kind of subterranean and enslavement that it was born from. And I'll leave it there, I guess, because I know you're gonna ask.
Okay, well, that's fantastic because you've laid the foundation for me to ask you about your work on a Black lesbian who probably most people have not heard the name of, who led an extraordinary life, and that would be Ruth Ellis. So could you talk a little bit about your work on Ruth Ellis and the way she was a self-making woman in a world of anti-Blackness? And it's a story of survival, love, pleasure, community, and above all, a refusal to be silenced or hidden away. And your discussions of her have really been, so talk a little bit about Ruth Ellis. I mean, obviously you could talk for a long time, but just a little bit.
Right. So she's a part of, I think, everyone's archive. We should all know her. And she was born in 1899 in Springfield, Illinois. She lived to be 101. And she's remembered as the oldest living out Black lesbian. And she, at the age of 16, she felt she had these particular desires about her sexuality. When she found the book, The Wellness of Loneliness. And after reading that text, she came up and she found this word, the term homosexuality. And from there, in these particular books she's reading, and she's trying to study to understand her sexuality and what she's feeling and what she's experienced. She then kind of comes to herself this realization that she is a lesbian. But I mean, it was 1915 when she was coming of age. And so this kind of frame of reference weren't necessarily acceptable. And she lived her life out loud, right? Like she has a memory because before she died, she did these amazing oral archives that she put together, some other people put together with her in it. And she talked about her father hearing her with women. She talked about her living with a longtime partner and girlfriend, and that she lived an out life.
Yeah. And yeah, pretty amazing. Okay, so the archives also contain stories of Black death, pain, suffering, and another person you've written about is Matrice Richardson, who I suspect is another name that people don't know. I think Matrice might have been a contemporary of yours, more or less, when this is a Black lesbian who was murdered at age 24 when you were in your early 20s. So can you talk a little bit about your work with her and how that's important to the Black Lesbian Archive?
It's so important because we don't know these particular histories and these bodies that exist, and we forget about them, right? And so Matrice Richardson, at the time I was in LA, and I do remember it being a really big topic subject and kind of search party happening within the community looking for Matrice Richardson, who had been arrested after exhibiting erotic behaviors and in Malibu, and the police in the middle of the night kind of let her go and walked this like empty, this very dark road where she's never really seen again. She's not seen again. And actually, when her body is found about 10 or 11 months later, it's dismembered, and it's found in this kind of cul-de-sac, and these images that are Blaxploitation like of, and it says, "Welcome to the land of the Afro hoes," and this figure, this Black figure all around with an afro that's looked like it's being tortured, and it just becomes a really horrific way in which to think about how many people in this particular archive have this story, because there are multiple, when I went looking, other stories similar to Matrice Richardson's. And the sad part was that as well, her sexuality becomes a really big part in the media exposure in terms of who's willing to publicize and talk about this missing woman and how she's able to get on certain magazine covers. Her family really understands the use of the image, and also this idea around queerness, right? Because it pretty much trumps this thing around Blackness. And so because she is identifiable, or she has a partner at the time, her partner, I believe, was from Hawaii. And she was a stud and Matrice's femme. And so those particular pictures and that connection to the LGBT community really helps her to get a bit of visibility in her case. And so there were over 300 missing Black girls and women at the time, but her picture, her story gets placed on a few magazines, in part because of her sexuality.
And there's never been any definitive decision about how she was murdered and what happened. Is that right?
No, the police actually, or the sheriff's station actually initially tried to rule it an accident and said that she was probably eaten by animals, although she was found in a cul-de-sac that's known for producing porn. And actually, they wouldn't have found her, but they were there looking for illegal marijuana growth. And so when they go looking for the marijuana, this is where they find her remains. And someone has set her remains there, and some of her clothing as well. But her parents have still been fighting to try to get them to find, additional resources or leads onto the case.
Mhm. Since we maybe have a little time, I wonder if you might want to say something about, and I hope I pronounce her name right, Zanelle Maholi, to give this discussion diasporic reach, because her work, that's probably another name. So we should, put these names out there. Ruth Ellis, was that it? Ruth Ellis, Matrice Richardson, and now Zanelle Maholi, who's a South African lesbian photographer, artist, who's had some pretty amazing shows, but she has a show called Faces and Phases, and she documents lesbian and trans lives in South Africa in a period of terrible repression. So you want to talk a little bit about her and what she adds to the Black Lesbian Archives?
Oh yeah, when I first discovered her work, I became so fascinated with her. That's what my dissertation initially was going to be about, her and her work. She's in South Africa. She calls herself a visual activist. And so she uses her camera to document corrective rape victims that have happened. And so in rural parts in South Africa, women who have been outed by family members or just community members as lesbians, usually butch women, are correctively raped, violently raped in the community, in public, and killed in some places or some reports. And not only are they killed, some of them also come in contact with HIV/AIDS. And so when she creates this particular kind of archive, most of the women in the archive that you can see are no longer with us. They've transitioned. So her work has become very important, especially when you think about, we can probably point to a couple of cases of corrective rape that have happened that made it into mainstream in the US, but they're not of Black women. And so her work, I think, brings to the forefront still the kind of terror and unsafety that happens within our Black community or communities, period. There are no safe spaces. And she's done a doc recently where she's documented several women, several victims, as they're talking about these horrific incidents that have happened to them from a parent, uncles, and neighbors.
Mm-hmm. This might be a place to say something a little bit about Black lesbian visual culture, because you and I have talked a lot about different Black filmmakers, YouTube series, TV programs. I mean, there's quite a bit there that adds to the Black lesbian archives. Is there any, would you like to say anything about any of the producers that you think, to give people ideas about what they might seek out to watch if they haven't seen Pariah or Watermelon Woman or...
Mm-hmm. Well, Watermelon Woman is a really good text when you think about that it's the first Black lesbian director that we know of, and she's producing this particular narrative based on her life and her experience, and it's a whole lineage there. And in fact, Cheryl Dunye, she directs still today. She did Queen Sugar, a lot of episodes within Queen Sugar and some others. But she also, I think, opens the door for women like Dee Reese, who did Pariah. And that's a Black girlhood story of a Black girl looking and searching for her sexuality. She does so in these really magical and wonderful ways. And she also comes from a transnational kind of background. Her family, they don't necessarily point to it, but her name, Akile, and her father speaks a different language in the film, but it points to these ways of being and this hardship that can also happen between mother-daughter in the community, and just finding your way as someone who doesn't quite know or have a label, right? Like that label becomes the issue in that particular text for Akile. She doesn't necessarily know how to gripe with being femme or stud or who am I, essentially. And so those texts, or those two texts, are really, I think, important and vital in this particular archive, and in that kind of genre of thinking in terms of Black lesbians, but also I think a really big space where Black women, Black lesbians, Black queer, LGBT folks have found much success is on YouTube and or creating YouTube series. And so I'm sure a lot of people, or not a lot here, but some may be familiar with Studville, Between Women, and all these shows. There are a lot of shows, and they really just centered on the life, Black queer life, Black lesbian life. And it seems like most of them are in the South, because Between Women is in Atlanta, and it looks at these women who are living their life, like everyday life, and as sexual minorities, but at the same time, they create this kind of this sense of self that's really contained, because there's no other bodies really in the frame. It's just them, but it gives you a sense of this liberatory kind of cinema that comes about through new media.
Mm-hmm. So that's one obvious way that people who want to gain access or learn more can connect to the Black Lesbian Archives. What do you think about the written texts that were so critical to use? So, do those old texts still carry weight for people today, or are we on to new texts? I mean, I like, for example, I'm not sure how many, if you don't take a Black Women's Studies course or a Women's Studies course, you don't know about the Combahee River Collective Statement from 1977, right? I mean, people may know more about Kimberly Crenshaw and her theory of intersectionality, but of course, so what do you think about connecting to the written texts of the Black Lesbian Archives?
I think it's necessary, right? Like if we don't connect to our foremothers and fathers and so forth, we lose that archive, we lose that language. And I mean, intersectionality, it is a part of the Black lesbian, lexicon. Interlocking systems of oppression then becomes intersectionality. And I also think about this new anthology just came out, an anthology on Black lesbian thoughts, Mouths of Rain, and they go back to the archive, and they uncover so much of that kind of identity structure, and they also combine it with contemporary texts, people who have been influenced by the gamut, right? And things that also I think that we might not even recognize as such. Like I think about The Color of Purple, right? Alice Walker's text, and these interesting moments in the actual text versus the movie, right? That are still there that then come about again in the play, right? So if you see the play goes into a little bit more depthness around intimacy and women. And so I think that these things are there and they're present. And there have been some interesting texts as well through the Black Lives Matter movement where they've continued to go back to the Combahee River Collective, and they've continued to go back to these particular movements and moments to situate how they became here. They have foundation in these particular texts and these ideologies.
So I see that on the chat, this is fantastic. Patricia Zimmerman is posting all these links to the different things you're mentioning, but I'm not sure she got Mouths of Rain. So could you hold that book up again and give its title and its editor so that people, wait, we can't see it. Read it for us, the editor's name.
Oh, it's Brianna Simone Jones.
Okay, so would you be able to identify the three main written texts that you think people should, to learn Black lesbian history, really should read? And I'd be willing to say the Combahee River Collective Statement, so relevant today, would be one of them. But do you have others that you would put on a must-read list?
Sister Outsider, anything Audre Lorde, of course. But one thing that I think I learned during my training, the doctoral training, was that, Black lesbian traditions, history is Black history, is Black studies, is Africana studies, right? And so it's there. And sometimes those markers, because we're more concerned about liberation and how can we get free, right? And so sometimes certain things get remissed. But I think that coming back to these texts are I think, part of the everyday. I even think about the pleasure activism, right? She returns to the uses of the erotic to talk about pleasure activism and its necessity in a today movement. And
you're talking about, what's her name? Anna Marie Brown?
Adrienne Maree Brown.
Adrienne Maree Brown, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
and I
that
mean,
book,
Alice Walker, there's a whole host of people I think that are here that are still here with us, and some who have transitioned in our ancestors. But these texts I think are still living and breathing. And important, I think that's one of the reasons why when I did that syllabus in the Hip Hop Studies Journal was that I wanted to make sure that not everyone is situated in the academy or in academia. So every text that I list and I put in there, I made sure I can find online, that they had access to it. So if you're using it at a community center, or you're using this in the classroom, that you can easily Google some things and just find these particular texts because they're there.
yeah.
You just don't know to find them or to look for them. Yeah.
And it's an important part of the point you were making, which is that archives don't just exist within institutions. They exist in many spaces and places. And I, from what I know of you, it's always been a really important for you to connect up resources to communities outside of academia. Well, I think I'm sort of ready to leave the discussion of the Black Lesbian Archives per se, unless there's anything more you want to say about it. Before we move on to the archives as a space for radical possibilities around sexuality. Any more you want to say about the archives that, like one time you made a distinction between small A archives and large A archives, and when I was thinking about it, I didn't remember exactly what you meant. What is that distinction?
Well, one is just, a building, an archival building, and then the other is an actual collection, right?
Okay.
And so it's not an important thing, but it is an important thing because this is something that is nowhere but everywhere. It's not a building. It's something that sometimes we can't easily locate, like the article or the little short story that I also wrote for the anthology. I talk about my aunt, right? And her lover, and walking in on them and then seeing her lover's body, and from there kind of understanding some things about myself at 6 years old. She's in this particular archive, and I think that is interesting to me, as well as how when I go back to this archive, I think about Jules Catch One. There's a doc about her as well on Netflix, because she has this amazing club for over 30 years, and she also has a clinic where she helps people in the community to get services that they probably couldn't afford. And so these are a part of, I think, for me, LA, California, just period across this kind of trans global identity structure around the archive, that it has pain in it, right? But it also, I think, has these ideas around intimacy, love, affection, every day, kind of ways in which we think and we breathe, and we start to see ourselves. And I think that becomes the biggest part of it, is that we get to center ourselves within these kind of ideas around who we are in the archive.
Beautiful, very beautiful. All right, so here's what I would like to do a little bit of a switch here, but it's all still part of the archives, and ask you about your work on Black female genitalia, where you address Black women's vulvas, which, as hope people know, have historically been viewed within a white supremacist culture as aberrant, excessive, pathological, as described in medical and scientific literature, as well as even, unfortunately, within feminism. And I want to start this discussion, because you write about it, by bringing up Judy Chicago's famous art installation, The Dinner Party, which I'll just describe briefly in case people in the audience, might not know of it. Judy Chicago was considered a bold, visionary feminist artist of the second wave feminism, a white woman. And she created this triangular banquet table and she made 39 different place settings to represent different women who were historically considered significant. And there were these beautiful porcelain plates, and then there were place settings with placemats and chalices, and very fancy, like it was a fancy banquet. And there was only one woman of African descent represented or invited to that dinner party, and that was Sojourner Truth. And the one other thing you need to know about the dinner party was that these plates all contained vulvar imagery, imagery of female genitalia. They were very beautifully constructed. They were raised. They weren't just flat plates. And Sojourner Truth's plate was one of only two that had no vulvar imagery at all. And you, Professor Horsley, have written that it was apparently impossible for Judy Chicago to imagine Sojourner Truth in her wholeness, in herself as a Black sexual woman. So what you do in your writing about Black genitalia is you reference the dinner party, but then also bring in the work of a lot of really brilliant Black feminist scholars, Lamonda Horton Stallings, Jennifer Nash, Hortense Spillers, Evelyn Hammonds. And we don't have time to go into the intricacies of the way you use their theory, but you do make a clear and bold argument in this context. And so I'm going to quote your words, but I need to set the stage for that first. What you've written about is that Black female genitalia have occupied something of a Black hole. Whole as in whole, H-O-L-E, but also whole as in W-H-O-L-E. And that even if I'm understanding your work correctly, Nicole, you're saying that even Black feminist and queer scholars have centered attention away. They haven't been willing to look directly at Black women's genitalia. They've looked above, around, below, and in your words, they are giving attention to Black hair and Black feet and the Black womb and the Black buttocks, but they don't talk about the genitalia. And so this is a quote from Professor Horsley. You ask, but what happens when we open up the Black pussy and listen to whose pussy is talking, how they speak back to damaging archetypes and hidden pussy histories in complex and productive ways? And that's something you aim to address in your work. And I hope that in those few minutes of laying the foundation of the dinner party and then this question that you raise, it does justice, and I'll ask you to say more about it. But I thought that we could go in one of two directions with this discussion. You teach an Intro to Black Sexuality class, so I know that you apply your thinking here about the denigration of Black genitalia and the fact that we need to reclaim them and see them as sites of pleasure and engage in pleasure activism. So maybe we have time to do both, for you to talk about your Intro to Black Sexuality class, but also to talk about something else you've written about, which is Black female hip hop artists who, let me see how I wanted to, who've unapologetically weaponized, and this is your word too, unapologetically weaponized Black pussy. And here you write about Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion and their WAP videos. So I'm going to throw it wide open. You can either go the route of talking about how you do this pedagogically, or what your thoughts are on the weaponizing Black pussy. But
how do you feel when you say that?
well, I was encouraged by you. I might not have gone there, but I knew it would bring your best thinking forward. So let's go.
Joy. It brings me joy. Yes. Well, I mean, and we could just say WAP, right? We okay. Understand what that is, right? WAP.
Well, you might need to say it once because, we got a diverse crowd here. We don't know. So what does WAP stand for?
Wet ass pussy, right?
Okay.
And so Cardi B and Meg Thee Stallion have the song WAP, but WAP was always in existence prior to the song. But what they do is they bring it to the mainstream so that, open up doors to have additional conversations, because it has done so. Gynecologists are tweeting and writing and producing things talking about the idea of lubrication and its importance. You have people having to talk to their children now about genitalia and their bodies. And so it opens up this kind of conversation that I think sometimes we dare not have. Actually, I taught today, all day today, and I teach the Black Sexualities course today. And in that course, usually the first thing we do is we think about our bodies. And if we can even name our bodies and the parts of our bodies, right? And have we looked at our bodies? And so, a couple of the assignments are for them to go and look. And just spend time with their bodies. And a lot of times students will say, they'll say vagina, right? They'll say vagina and not vulva. And so they don't know the difference between the two because how would they, right? I mean, even as I grew up, I'd never heard the word vulva before. You know, so I just thought, you know, vagina was the whole entire gamut. And so most recently, there have been 3D models and other sorts of that have come out to really teach us about our bodies and our clitoris. And I always bring and put this out because I think it's the most amazing and awesome thing to see that this is, you know, our body, our clitoris. And so the students really engage this and they get to know the body parts, each part, each leg of it. And they also get to see things that probably, you know, usually we don't, you know, like when I think about pictures and text, usually I don't get to see things that have a skin tone that is similar to mine. Usually I am erased from the kind of discussion and the knowledge base. And so to bring these things into a particular class, I think is so important. And I feel privileged to be able to teach such a class on a campus that is open to me teaching this kind of stuff to students who are also open into learning it. And I have the most amazing students. And I also teach a upper division course that continues the conversation to put it more into thinking about film through adult movies or the pornographic kind of gaze. So, but this point, this rupture for me is more about thinking about sex and sexuality, thinking about Blackness in that conversation, and also having conversations around sexual health and education, right? And so there's a lot that we don't know. And so how do we have these conversations and start to understand just how do we take care of our body, right? Mind, body, and soul. And so those become really important aspects, I think, to this work. And I bridge it to hip hop because I think that this music, right, the music, the artists, the people, the lived experiences bring us to these points to really think about and talk about our bodies and our lived experiences. I think about the City Girls and they have a song called This Pussy Talk, right? And when I heard the song initially, I thought about that, right? Like she's saying her WAP talks so many different languages and money and, you know, like on and on and on. And it's just the most amazing thing when you really think about it, that as a Black woman, your body can really talk and you hear it, you understand it, and you respond to it, and you have that agency, that power. Because I think at the heart of all of these conversations, we're thinking about power. I'm thinking about power and power dynamics and the ways in which we negotiate these ideas around being unapologetic with thinking about our bodies and loving ourselves and pleasure as a point of activism. And I think all of these things are important, especially as we are trying to move away from these ideas that are disparaging, right, around Blackness, that if you're a Black woman or you're a Black person, you're ugly, you're too dark, or these things that we're constantly told silently and also out loud every day in messages, even erasures, right? It could be little things, but they're big things. And so I think it's important to have these conversations. And, you know, I think sometimes probably students are amazed, but there's like so many texts. And I'm pointing around because like I'm surrounded by books, like my favorite thing in the world, I'm a bookie. And all these books, they deal with these ideas around Black sexuality, the Black body. You mentioned L.H. Stallings, that was my advisor. Stallings and Marlon Bailey and a few other people who I trained under who are doing this amazing work really, I think, open the doors to really thinking about sexuality in that liberation moment. And also, you know, I think about educators, like how can we then have sex education in the classroom or in K through 12 education and it be healthy. It can, you know, help us have these conversations with our children to really maybe prevent some hurtful and harmful things to happen. And I think that these bridges can be made through, you know, music, through R&B, hip hop, and also just having the ability to turn to maybe a text or a community member of some sort to really talk about and think about sexuality and sex.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question here. I'm mindful of the time. We're at 8 o'clock. I think we want to leave time for questions from the audience. So Patty or Annie, do I get to say when this conversation is stopping and we're taking questions that are posed in the chat?
Yeah, it might be a good point to do it now since it's 8 o'clock, and Claire will peruse the chat and read them as she finds them to make it a little easier.
Okay, so before Claire comes in with hers, I just want to thank Nicole for being so open. And I think I'll ask Nicole one last question whilst Claire peruses the chat. Can we do that? Or Claire, do you have a question right away?
And why don't you ask one last question? It'll give people time to, there's one I've seen on the chat, but we'll
Okay.
hope for others.
So I mean, it's kind of a broad, it's more of an ending question. I think it's maybe what we mean to get at the very end when we ask people what their takeaways are. But Professor Horsley, I'd like to know what's your desire or hope for your work, and that what it will help, what is it that you hope it will help people to both learn and unlearn? And is there any specific ideology or set of ideologies that you're really seeking to dismantle in doing the work that you do?
Anti-Blackness is always right. Anti-Blackness, thinking about liberation, and I'm on this quest to like live a pretty pleasurable, happy, existence in life. And so that would be one of the things that I hope that people take away with this kind of politics, the politics of feeling good. Who taught you how to be happy? Who taught you how to feel good? Could be questions I think that you put on the table when you're really thinking about the work that I'm doing and that others are doing in a particular field, and helping us see and think about the Black female body, the Black body period differently.
Excellent. So let's start with, it looks to me like there are 48 comments in the chat. I guess that a lot of that is posting links, but I see a question from Claire. You want to read that question from Ellie?
Sure. So the first question is, how do you believe that labels, lesbian, etc., affect different communities? As a part of the LGBTQ plus community, I've heard many different opinions on labels, and I'm wondering what you think about them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I center myself in the Black community, a Black Liberation Project. And, I think that that's so minuscule when I think about being free, like how do we get free? And how do we stop people from killing us, right? And so a label, bitch, it's just not, necessarily, I think necessary to always engage, right? I think that for me, on the ground movements are about respect and dignity. And so when I think about the Black Lives Matters movement, and even, issues around gender, pronouns, how do we call each other? How do we name each other? Because it's all about respect, right? And honoring how people see themselves. And so I think those become the most important thing. I think that how you label yourself is a personal issue. It's political and it's personal. And it changes maybe, and you have the right, to change your label or your sexual identity as you see fit. I know growing up that there were certain kind of negative connotations around being bisexual or saying certain things, right? But what it did was it just really stunted, your ability to just explore and be curious and let your curiosity open doors and possibilities to say, that's yucky, that's yummy, I don't want to do this. And sometimes, labels, they're necessary, right? But sometimes they also can be harmful when we don't do a deeper kind of introspection. And when I think about Black liberation, always it's about, well, how does that get me free? How does it get us free?
Mm-hmm. And maybe the debates about labels actually distract from that larger freedom project. Claire, another question?
It's rumored that Walt Disney will host a show very soon called Coming Out. Do you feel the masses will be able to receive it in an education stance or downplay it similar to Harry Potter?
Disney. It's Disney, right? And I think coming out stories, talk about coming in stories, these notions of coming out, who gets to come out, right? And so once again, power structures. And so I would be more curious on who gets to tell their story. Yeah, and where's broadcast? I think that we always want to, have this kind of utopic kind of understanding around liberation, especially amongst capitalism. And so when we're in a capitalistic society, it's about what sells, right? And it's not always what's right or what we should be doing or how we should approach something. But I mean, it's Disney. And so, I mean, I even have comments or thoughts around Beyonce doing Black is King through Disney, right? So, I mean, I would have to see the text to really, engage it.
What's it like teaching and writing about these topics at Ithaca College? What are the ways you're supported or challenged by this local context? The institution, the community, any of it?
Mm. Wow, that's such a big question. I think that it feels great, actually. I can say that it feels so loving and caring that my school, my college, my job allows me to do the things that I love to do, right? And I don't get pushback. I get supported. I get such amazing things from being able to just exist, right? And that makes a difference, especially when you're a Black woman in a very white space, a Black queer woman in a very white, and sometimes you don't see queer people's space, to be able to have moments of pleasure when you feel isolated, right? And I thought about, even in terms of this conversation, is that, throughout COVID, the pandemic, I don't think that I've sat at IC and talked to another Black woman professor, period, right? In a year, I have not sat with one and had a conversation, right? From IC, that is. And, all of that, I could probably say Black people, period. And that, it does something to the psyche, to not see yourself over and over again. And so those moments of pleasure and support and love, and that are regenerative and giving, they matter. They sustain me, at least, so that I can continue to do the work.
Loving all the reading recommendations. Do you have any feminist podcasts to recommend as well?
Probably, but I can't think of any in the moment. A lot of things about pleasure. There's horribility that I really love. There are quite a few, but like I can't think of them off the top of my head.
I want to ask you about theorizing from lived experience in your personal life and your writing. I think often in today's theory, writing from personal experience is also writing that does not make universal claims, but instead speaks to the particular and is careful to be kind of limited in its scope. But that hasn't always been the case. Someone like Audre Lorde, for example, is deeply grounded in personal experience, but also makes big claims about the erotic as power, uses of anger, etc. I wonder about your thoughts on this, or if you feel this tension between individual and universal in your own writing.
Oh, absolutely. The political is personal as the personal is very political, right? I don't think that I have a choice as a Black subject to not, engage. Well, I do have a choice, right? But I choose not to walk into and bring my community and these ideas around Black liberation, because it's always about how do I get free? How do we get free? At the end of the day, that's what's my motivation, right? And so when I'm thinking about all these things, it's not just about my freedom, it's about those that I walk with. I think about my parents, my family, and the things that I wish that, they could have had or they would have known. And so those things are quite, I think, present and always in the room when I'm thinking and working and writing and reading.
The Black identity of women, specifically queer women, has been warped by white superiority and oppression. Do you think modern media representations have done a good enough job negating these images or further encouraging them? How can we make sure that we recognize media representations aren't being ingrained in subconscious bias?
Oh, okay. I mean, that's a pretty big as well kind of, question. And I think that we want so much or expect so much from capitalism and we forget why it functions, right? Why it's so. People now hate Bell Hooks in part because she called Beyonce a terrorist, right? And she called Beyonce a terrorist in part because of the kind of grasp, the hold that she has on people, right? On young people at that. And that, and at the time when she says this, Beyonce hasn't quite yet, gone to really centering Africa and African diaspora in her work. But like people will not even use her work anymore because of that statement. But I think that we understand the visuality, the troubling vision around Blackness that I think Nicole Fleetwood would say. It's present, it's there. I think it's a project that we always get to work at. Independent media is really important, I think, in these conversations, which I think probably over the last year, or 4 years, we probably really started to engage and understand propaganda, and where we get our media and our sources is really so important. I can't say that I have a lot of, I don't want to say faith in mainstream media or these kind of impossibilities, but I think there are possibilities, because I think of Queen Sugar, I think of certain texts that do some of the work, right? And while they're doing the work, there's also some problems there as well. But I think that nothing is impossible, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Being so unapologetic about pleasure isn't something people hear very often. So I'm wondering if you've experienced negative reactions to your work or your teachings, and if so, how have you dealt with that?
I mean, no, I haven't. Really, I haven't. And I don't know, like I said, this has been a very supportive space for me to do the work. And when I go to conferences, is so many other people doing very similar work. But I do find myself censoring myself sometimes, right? When I am doing work and, should I say this? Should I write this like this? Should I use another word? How would somebody receive that, right? Even going into this conversation, do I use Black pussy? Do I talk about it? What kind of feelings would it invoke? And so, I mean, all of those are very much important, but I think that that's why it's so phenomenal to have texts that you can turn to, such as Audre Lorde and Barbara Smith's and I mean, Pat Parker. She has a poem, I Love a Woman. And in the poem, like she really, she goes there, right? In this kind of interesting like layout that she has with saying that she loves a woman, a white woman, and that her family, tells her don't bring friends, right? Don't bring your friends when you come. All of these things, I think, they help us breathe better. And when you see yourself and hear yourself, and you can touch, I think people who have similar experiences or are doing similar things, it helps you. And so I think that's why community is really important.
Well, directly related to what you just said, question in the chat, do you have any advice for Black students as they navigate the racial social difficulties that come with going to a predominantly white institution?
Ooh, that's heavy. I've only been to predominantly white institutions, PWIs, my whole life. I've always like really said that I wish that I could have went to HBCU, but I know that there would have been other issues, right? As a Black, queer, or lesbian woman, that would have been within that. But I think that is so powerful that you have spaces that you can create and make your own and fellowship with people and build coalitions, right? And have conversations and find support so that, you can speak truth to power, that you can come together and speak to, the powers that be around the things that you need to feel whole and complete. And trust. I advise a few groups, student groups, and I have sat with students who have experienced extreme trauma and harm done to them in the classroom, right? And it's not easy. And so, we have to find spaces where they're safe, where we can have conversations, where we can feel heard. And I love that our students are so activated. Like they come up with these brilliant statements. You all like really, I think, stand for what you believe in. And I think that that's the most brilliant thing ever that you can do is to have a voice. And to find community that can help you survive and do more than survive, right? Yeah.
Somebody in the audience has their hand raised, and I hope I am not mispronouncing your name. Cypress, right?
Yes, hello. Hi. First and foremost, want to give so much thanks to Dr. Horsley. Um, I could go on and on, but I'm gonna just stop at like gratitude. um, but I guess my question is kind of how we've seen just pan out even in this here discussion, like when we're having these like hard discussions and very intimate discussions in very several ways, like especially across racial lines. Um, I guess like my question comes in like with your suggestions about or your thoughts about like um, professors or teachers or educators who may not be a part of the marginalized groups that we're talking about and who are not Black, who are not femme, who are not lesbian. Like, how do they go about like upholding and incorporating these voices that are traditionally underrepresented without overstepping? Because I feel like sometimes there is this like notion that it's like, oh, I'm not Black or I'm not this, so I can't tell you anything about that. But it's like also we're all expected to like move through a like white cis het like Christian dominant culture where it's like that is the normal and we're all expected to like align in that way. So not perpetuating that either, but just your thoughts about like how outside of that demographic can go about upholding, giving a platform to, and I guess essentially advocating and being like an accomplice to this work without overstepping boundaries of like not having that expertise that is experiential knowledge.
Wow. Um, I think that, that is one, I mean, we assume that people want to do that work and that they're capable of doing that work. Everyone's not capable, nor everyone is willing to do that work, right? And so we find those people in those places, and that's where we find home, right? And so you try to stay far away from the people who really don't make you feel good or contribute to the things that you want or need in your life, I think. And we've come to learn, I think, as a community, right, that we can't make anybody do or be anything that they don't want to do or be. And having expectations of people rather than meeting them where they are and understanding that to have a conversation, I think, is one of the ways in which we get to have dialogue, because I think we don't have enough dialogue sometimes. And I get why we don't, right? Because you don't want to be gaslit. You don't want to be subjecting yourself to additional harm. And so sometimes that work is not yours to bear. It's other people. And we have people on campus, I know, who are excellent at these conversations, who are very supportive, who will step in and help and assist with that work. And I think that listening is so important. I think it's like, like if you're in a relationship, you learn in your relationship, right, how to have this special kind of language and to negotiate and realize that you might not agree on everything, but it's about that love at the end of the day, or that thing that you want to cultivate, to keep and maintain. And I think that at the end of the day, it's about you and your health and your happiness and these things. And so fixing people, I don't really think is a part of your ministry, your testimony, right? And so, like I think that there's people, and I can point you to some people who probably can help and assist with those particular kind of conversations.
So I don't see other questions on the chat, but if you had a question and I missed it, please jump in or raise your hand or put a question on the chat. Or Carla, you want to jump back in?
Well, I thought that was a fantastic set of questions. And maybe, I don't know, Nicole, I think we're kind of at time here. Nicole, is there anything else that you would like to put front and center? I mean, I think one thing we didn't talk about is you sometimes, label your area of work as Black sexual economics. And we haven't really talked about sex work and the labor of sex work and the relationship between sex work and pleasure, but it's a huge topic. So I think that's the only thing that we haven't covered that we thought we might. But is there anything else you want to address? Oh, she's muted.
Not particularly like,
I think
no.
it's been quite a stimulating, great discussion myself. Patricia or Annie, are we?
Oh, and I mean, looking out, like I see some amazing people like Catherine Ellis, like is amazing, does sex work, occupational therapy and sex work. Amazing. One of the founding members of YOLOA, United Lesbians African Heritage, Yolanda Willington, amazing. Mo, LA, like just amazing community people who do amazing work. So thank you all for coming. Like I'm so honored to like see you.
This has been an absolutely fantastic discussion, and thank you, Carla, so much for this wonderful interview, and Dr. Nicole Horsley, we cannot thank you enough for this marvelous conversation. And shall we give a round of
Now it's time to turn on your cameras, unmute, and do a big round of applause for Dr. Nicole Horsley and Dr. Carla Golden.
So Patricia, do we do the takeaway exercise? Is that something you?
I think we're at the end.
Oh, we're at the end.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey everyone, I'm wondering if the full recording is going to be available.
You broke up. Could you repeat that, please, Catherine?
Yeah, sure. Is the full recording going to be available?
It will, but we're in the middle of a 3-week festival, so
Soon as possible.
as soon as possible would be,
Right.
I think, our answer.
Yeah, we've archived the whole chat, which had lots and lots in it, as well as the actual, recording.
Yeah, all the
And-
references in the chat are admirable.
that
Yeah.
chat was fantastic.
It
Yeah.
was.
Thank you to everybody who was involved in that. That was amazing.
Hey,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you, Dr. Horsley.
Hey, Kate, how you doing?
I'm great. That was lit. I loved it. I
So
didn't
how was
catch
your
the very
break?
beginning. Yeah, so I want to make sure I get all the juice, all the goodness.
You know, we got it. We all about the juice, right?
Yes, I want that. So thank you very much. And
Thank
thank you for putting
you.
this on. It was lovely.
Hey, Monique. You're muted.
Monique, we don't have any sound from you.
Sometimes your headset might be muted too. No,
No sound, Monique. I mean, if a backup would be to write what you wanted to say in the
in the
chat.
chat.
Sorry to give you more work, Monique.
I just want to give a big shout out to our SPLEF team. Boy, you guys were really on the ball. Thank you. And
Really?
we didn't get to use our cool little, you know,
5 and 10 minutes, I know, yeah.
Yeah,
but-
how come?
Well, we
Well,
didn't need it. We were well
didn't
within
need it.
the time.
we're actually at 8:20. So, you know, things
Yes.
have their
No, it was
own,
perfect.
Rhythm.
we have their own organic life, and we went where it took us, you know? So, and that was great, Claire, that you called on that somebody raised their hand. You know, that's the idea of the meeting, is that, you know, if people wanted to jump in, we ought to let them.
Yeah, I was glad that
Yeah.
you and another person pointed my attention to the fact that their hand was up.
You know,
So.
that was
Yeah.
more questions than
Yeah,
are-
excuse me. I just want to get Monique in here because her audio isn't working, and Nicole
Excellent.
and Carla, Monique wrote in the chat, so you both might want to take a look at it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Monique.
Nice.
Ah,
Now we hear you.
I think we just heard you.
Oh.
Unless
No,
that was
No,
somebody-
it's
somebody else, I think.
next time.
Yeah. Well,
How
This
many,
is where you want to be able to read lips, you know?
how many people were here, Patty?
at the height,
70, I think.
70.
Very good.
Our best audience for an F2F yet.
And also the most questions, right? I mean,
Oh yeah, the questions were fantastic. Really fantastic.
Yeah. I
was-
think
it
it
was
went
terrific.
really well.
It was beautiful. It was really terrific. It's just so fascinating, so fluid, completely seamless. I was hanging on both of your every word. It was really great.
Yeah.
Really? Usually Carla and I have like the most interesting conversations, period. But I was like, let's just have a conversation like we do all the time on the phone or in text. 'Cause we like can text for like days. Like,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you were both fantastic and you both seemed incredibly relaxed. It was just great.
Yeah.
yeah,
We
even
are
if
the
it's so
screen.
crispy, huh?
Yeah. How did you feel it went, Nicole and Carla? Nicole, how did you feel it went?
I don't know. Like I was like, I'm a nervous person, period. And so
Mhm.
although I'm on this all day, every day, I have Anissa and I have Michaela in classes right now. And so yeah, I just get a little kind of antsy, like make sure I say the right thing. And so some of those questions were a little different for me because I was like, well, can they be about sex? Because I can deal with those questions. And these ones, like how do they deal with or talk to people in our community at a PWI? Like, I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah, some of those questions were really big questions
Mhm.
that are hard, I think, to distill for you down to a couple sentences in this kind of environment. Like you could do a whole session on Zoom for an hour on some of those questions. So I thought you did a wonderful job.
I did too. I did
I
too.
was trying to watch my
drilling
facial
through.
expressions. Like I'm a facial. I was like trying not to make faces, so I hope I succeeded.
Oh, you were so thoughtful and warm and generous in your answers.
Mm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because Anissa and Michaela could like, my facial expressions.
Yeah.
No, you
So,
had good lighting, Nicole, and you're a beautiful woman, and it really shows.
Thank you.
I almost wish though that you were wearing a different color, because then we could see your hair.
Oh,
Because right now you have black hair and black sweater.
I could have put on a different color hair and it would have been okay, I guess. Like,
Yeah, whatever.
How did you think it went, Carla? We just try to do a little bit of a lessons learned so we can learn how to do these better.
I thought it went really well. Very pleased. I mean, I think the measure of how well it went was that there were just so many questions for Nicole that would, she was able to shine in a way that people felt really comfortable asking a pretty wide range of some serious questions.
Yeah. And a lot of questions. And, one thing that Claire and I always look for is, how do you keep people, right? It's one thing to get these big numbers, but at some events, you'll lose people after about 30 minutes. And this, I think the bleed was maybe 10 people,
Yeah.
which is really, I think, good.
One thing I think was confusing is that when we came on in the beginning and you pointed out that there'd be a 10-minute warning and a 5-minute warning, is that didn't take into account when I was supposed to end to start the question period. So all of a sudden I was looking at my clock and I thought, wait a minute, if I wait until 8:20 to get the first 10-minute warning, we won't have had opportunity for the audience to ask questions. So that's why I had to ask at 8 o'clock. So just for future, I mean, maybe people should know the exact time when they should stop to start the questions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good point. Yeah, the timing really just was for the wrap up the entire
And,
session
it's sort of
during
like,
the questions.
it could go longer, it could go shorter. I think one of us might mention this, to say, oh, it's time for questions or whatever. So you don't even have to ever think about it, right?
Yeah. In fact, I agree with that because there were so many questions and Claire was just reading them and then, took the 2 from the group. And rather than have that period at the end where, there was the pressure, are there any more questions and waiting, we would have been fine to just end it right there, right? Because
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And
I
so
mean,
we will jump
Annie
in.
popped in and said, let's end it. Things have an organic arc.
We're in a
and-
big conversation.
And you don't want to cut it off too early, but you also don't want it to like bleed out till there's no energy, because you want to always end. Claire's the dramatist, but you want to end on the peak, not on the down. So I thought it ended on the peak. So Annie, thanks for that call.
Yeah,
That
but
was good.
I think the questions, you can take them as they come. Some people do it that way, like early on, if they come, if they're pertinent to what's been said. And then other people are a little bit more, formal. They'd like to wait to do them all chunked together. And that's up to us, to you.
Yeah.
Well, I also think I remember, Patty, when I did the interview, you actually texted me and said, during the interview, and said maybe 5 minutes more and then wind down. And that was so helpful to me, and I forgot about it, but should have done that. Might be something we want to do with future interviews so that the interviewer doesn't have to be thinking about the time.
That's
Just
a great
to get,
idea.
just to have the text, the mobile phone of the interviewer, because when Claire did it, I was like, we just text somebody and say, start wrapping, move to this, just so it's the pressure's off the interviewer and can go along.
will you post the whole chat for people somewhere so that they can go look for all the references that are on it?
Not the chat, we'll post the live, but if you scroll in, the bloggers made a document of all the references. And it's from Erin Pedersen did it. Are you here, Erin?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, Erin did it. And Erin, can you post that again just so people don't have to scroll?
Yeah, of
And
course.
so for people here, Erin will post it and you can download it and you'll have everything.
Yeah, it is possible for the host of the meeting to get a copy of that chat. I think Nicole would like to see it because there were people in there thanking her and, just if that's possible.
Yeah, it'll be in the FLEF backend archive along with the entire FLEF series. So
it will be accessible to.
it won't go away.
I don't think we'll post the chat. I don't think we legally can post a chat.
But if you download what Erin just posted,
You have everything.
It'll download onto your own laptops.
Yeah,
Yep.
so you can download that and you'll have the links. I do want to make one suggestion before we all sign off is Carla, Claire, and Nicole, you might just take like 45 seconds and scroll through the chat because there are a lot of feedback and thank yous.
Okay.
So we'll give you some time to do that before we shut down.
Well,
Okay.
how were you able to write down all the references?
Well, Nicole, the way we're doing this, we have a big production team. So, we have Annie and Phil are professional producers, and then we have students who work for the festival, and they know that their job is posting links. So we had 4 students posting links, and I was posting links anytime I heard something.
And I tried, but I couldn't keep up with Patty. She was
Yeah, I beat
a
you
hell of a long
tonight.
ways ahead of me.
I beat you tonight. So we
Yes,
were
you did.
posting, and then Aaron, who's on our FLEF team, had the idea to just take the links and put them in one document, because someone back channel you, Aaron, for that.
Yeah, somebody had asked if all the links would be available in a Word document. So when we started questions, there was like a pause. So I kind of just went back and transferred all of them to a document for people.
You are fast.
And
Yeah.
it's
Yes.
amazing. And it's a real tribute to both of you, Nicole and Carla, that people were that interested that they wanted all those references so that they could look things up and read what you'd been talking about. So.
And is there, will there be a listing available of everybody who came? Because I didn't really scroll through the pages. I didn't see who was there, but I kind of like,
No,
Unfortunately,
no.
once you shut the Zoom down, it
How about the list of registrants?
that shuts down as well.
Oh,
We don't-
really?
Yeah, we don't have it after we shut down.
Okay.
Well, I remember a lot of the faculty who were there and some of the students, the ones whose
Yeah.
names I know.
Yeah, I would have had to download it before the event started into Excel, and we had another event at 4, so we only had like 45 minutes in between. So I really focused on sending the links out again to everybody so that, they would a half hour before be reminded and have the link at the top. So sorry about that.
No problem.
But that link to the links of the chat just now is great because they're all there. It's like, thank you for that very much, Aaron.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
You're welcome.
I mean, this is very much a live event. If this was a room full of people, you may or may not, have gotten all their names who walked in the door. So, it feels very lively in that sense.
Yes, it was very, yeah.
Very.
Yeah, there were a lot of Ithaca College faculty
Good.
there that I noticed because I was letting them in and I was welcoming people. And then-
The HNS dean was there. The HSHP dean was
Dean.
there.
Yeah, I welcomed both of them, and any professor that I knew, I did a private welcome to. So, it was a really good audience and a very engaged one. So I'm sorry we don't have those lists in the detail you want, Carla. It's something for us to
That's
think
fine.
about. We've never had anybody ask for it.
Yeah.
In these.
Well, we also haven't had numbers this big, so.
I took a note from Soraya. This was on another event, and Soraya indicated that she did not look at who was on the Zoom because it was going to make her nervous. And I decided I would adopt the same thing. So I didn't look at who was on the Zoom. But now that it's over, I'm interested to see who was there.
Yes.
I'll
Yeah.
send you an email, Carla, and tell you all the names I
Yeah.
can remember that I think you'll.
There's a
Care about it.
sensitive issue about lists of registrants that's come up in the Zoomiverse, which is, people are registering in private to go to the event. And, there's a lot of debate about this. Should you release that list? Because they accuse you of data mining them. So I think there's a lot of people, at least in my media world, who say, don't release lists of people because you want to really protect that they signed up for this event. And these events are events you register for, indicating that they're actually a closed event and a private event. So I don't know if I would actually send the list out. I'd be kind of nervous about that. I definitely would never post it, but I don't know that I would send it out. So it seems to be, something people are really hypersensitive about because of all the data mining on digital footprints. So
I think there's some real privacy questions there.
Sure there
Yeah,
are. And
really
it's
are.
the list of participants at a conference is always the first thing a totalitarian government asks you for. So
Right. So people are trying to be careful about it. We can tell on the back end who's registering, and, we can kind of see like it's good data for marketing, So you can look and see like, oh, this looks like all professors or people from other institutions. So then you can start working to kind of develop your student audience, right? And we've seen that happen on I was looking today to check.
We definitely had far more students than we've had at previous,
Highest number of students, no question,
yeah, by a lot.
by a lot.
You know why? You know why?
Because they love you.
No, WAP. WAP brings everybody to the table.
I didn't know you were talking about that.
Oh, that's
They didn't know that though.
People know. They know. If you know me, you know WAP is gonna be in the conversation. So, and then I got text. The best part was when I made Carla say it. Bam, priceless.
Kudos, Nicole.
F2F.
It's very hard to make Carla feel uncomfortable about anything. So good job there. Kudos.
Yeah.
I think we're done. And I guess I just want to say thank you. And for
Thank you.
FLEF, I want to really say thank you to Women's and Gender Studies, again, to Carla and Nicole. Thanks for being part of this year's Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival. Thank you, Annie and Phil, for all your beautiful back end help. Thank you, Claire. I really like this strategy of having someone just focus on the questions. It felt cleaner to me. And especially, you know, the interview is so intense also for the interviewer to keep that structure in mind. So I think it's something we should think about, Claire, moving forward. I kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of Cuomo-esque, which is maybe not the best thing to say right now. And, you know, just to conclude, I really want to thank the FLEF team, people who are still here, Kayla, Anissa, Micaiah, and Aaron. Really good job on the posting. And were you able to welcome students and professors you knew as well?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you welcome people, that also helps them stay, right? And because you go back and forth, and there were a couple of people who wanted to know what else was going on in FLEF. And so I was sending links out. And then they were like very bossy, like send it to my email, not to me here. And you know, so I was kind of being a concierge, but I really want to thank Aaron, Micaiah, Kayla, and Anissa. Good job on the back end. This was really lively, and I know it can be tough that you don't get to fully 100% listen because you have to also be researching, but that so many people were asking for those links shows what a really great job you did. So
plus intense listening, you know. Yes.
And thank you from me as well. Thank you to all of you, everybody involved. This was really just a wonderful event.
Agreed. Thank you, everybody. I'm leaving now because I'm hungry. I didn't eat
okay,
Thank
go
you.
eat.
Thank
Good night,
you.
everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks very much.
Thank you a lot.
Nicole.